Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday, August 30th, and Istio Combined Work Group Meeting Note. And the first topic, since Callia's topic is fairly quick, let's talk about performance test blocking the 119 release. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Francis. I just wanted to update everyone because we did have the release scheduled for the 29th. And we did enforce code freeze, so we've been holding all of the PRs after the code freeze. However, Andrea found that there were some issues with the performance tests, and I think that she's been talking to John about it, so I kind of wanted to hear from them just to get a quick update about what's going on.
Yes, good question. I have mostly been just observing, and Brian and Andrea are kind of doing most of the work. It sounded like last I saw, we had seen possible anomalies, but we also saw a lot of noise, and we were trying to figure out if it's actually regression, if it's just noise, if we can reduce the noise and whatnot. So it's still inconclusive. One question I have: what is the date that we targeted for release? Like
yesterday, 29th.
Oh, yesterday. Okay, so we're already behind schedule. Every second we spent on this. Okay. And that's the last blocker is we're ready to press the release button once someone says the performance is good. Or
yeah, we just need that. I'm working on the release notes. Will release notes block the release, or can those go in like a little bit after?
Release notes will also block the release because people get mad when we release it without the notes.
Shouldn't do a silent release.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll get that PR out for release notes like ASAP, and then hopefully it'll all just like work out. But other than that, yeah, the PRs are ready. Like we already have them approved, so we just need to take the whole label off to trigger the build and then trigger publish.
Okay, awesome. Is there a PR up for the release notes already, by the way? We're just working on finishing it up.
No, I generated them, so I just need to like put them in the right place. And yeah, so that PR should be out in a couple hours.
Okay, because usually we have the automated ones, but then we also do some editorial kind of blog-ish post about it. So
okay, yeah, that, I have the automated one. So I think the process is just to put the PR up and let people cook on that, and then to just collate it all.
Okay, so it sounds like okay, sounds good. I will make sure that Brian knows that this is kind of the last blocker. I think he's prioritizing it anyways, but just in case. And we'll make sure that he updates on the Slack, and then everyone else, once you get those release notes PR up, maybe send it somewhere that people look at, and we can get some eyes on that. And then maybe next week.
Can you send to the release 119 channel when the release notes draft is out, so that other people can help review, because the machine generated sometimes not as readable as we'd like for some of the features. And then the other thing is, do we have anybody working on the release blog?
The performance test? I'm sorry, which one?
The release blog, right?
Oh, the blog.
Is that also part of the release manager responsibilities? Because I know I guess I let Craig know, and then he announces things on Twitter, and I think I do the usual and post on Discuss, but I...
then on the release, there's the automated release notes, but then there's also like the announcement. Here, I'll send a link of the 1.18 one.
Yeah, so I saw Paul is online. How did it work for the prior release? Is it the release manager wrote that?
Yeah, I wrote it all. Yeah, I did it.
Yeah, so we should just make sure that at least someone is writing it. And that person probably shouldn't be Craig, because I think he's not readily available these days.
Okay. Is he still going to handle Twitter?
I think he can do the tweeting part, but he had a baby, so he's not free to do as much work as previously.
Okay.
Or if not, we can handle the Twitter and steering.
All right. Okay. I will do the release notes, send that to the channel, gets her on the blog? Will the blog block the release?
I think it's best to have them all, and
Yeah.
we can, if the blog is not amazing, we can always have a first draft published and then improve it over time if need be. But I think yeah, the blog's just a page of just the kind of summary of the notes. It shouldn't be too hard.
Oh, okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for doing all this work and bringing all this up.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. I think that's it on 119 stuff.
So anything else on the perf test, because that's essentially a blocker there. I think Andrea is on the call. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so I think John mentioned it earlier that initially we found that there was a degradation, but then and then we were able to repeat it once on another environment. So I tried inside IBM, Brian tried inside Google. He hit it once, but not the other time. So that's why now we're saying it's slightly inconclusive. So I think Brian is doing some investigation, and I'm trying to create some more clusters just to see if I can reproduce it again. Yeah.
Okay, I just found that Brian's actually out of office for the next week, so we should definitely not rely on Brian. Maybe we can get someone else in addition to Andrea to do it.
Yeah, because I think we need more than one environment.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, having two to just be a bit more consistent and sure.
Okay, so we need someone here besides Andrea.
Any chance you want to do a quad?
Okay.
I could potentially do it as well, but
I don't think I can do it today or tomorrow. But
Do we absolutely need someone from Google, or?
So it seems like we've only figured out how to get them to run on IBM and Google. I think Fasila had tried to run it and she was not successful. It does take a little bit of time to figure out how to get some of it going, and there's some provider specifications, right? So I don't know who else wants to try. Yeah.
Let's see. So John, do you know how long Brian's on PTO for? Is he just out today, or is he?
it's a
out for-
long time, like on September 5th.
Oh, okay. Yeah, never mind about that. So then our next best hope is Quad. Okay, so Quad, would you be able to get to the? You said not in the next couple of days, but will you be able to get to that by the end of the week?
can try tomorrow. I think. Oh, you said today. I wasn't planning, so I don't think.
Right. Okay, thank you. And Quad, if you can try that tomorrow, coordinate with Andrea, and let's see what may be going on there. All right. Anything else on this? Thank you, everyone. Let's go to lay and witness topic. Actually, would one of you mind presenting? It's probably easier that way.
Sure, I can present. Give me 1 second. Are you able to see?
It's coming up. Yeah, it's there. It's a little squished though.
Okay.
Can you make the window longer?
Window longer. Yeah.
No, just squish like a pancake. Yeah, you need more height. There we go.
Okay. So this mostly is about asking the community to comment on this RFC doc. So Istio Telemetry API is currently alpha. So this doc scope for the work to drive Istio Telemetry API from alpha to beta. So we have seen a few comments, and please feel free to comment more. And It's not a detailed design document. It's a scoping document to define the work required for drive the telemetry API from alpha to beta.
Yeah, I read through the doc, and it's probably been updated since I originally commented yesterday or 2 days ago, but I had trouble understanding it. Like, there was a bunch of contradictory statements and a bunch of like, it was hard to understand what we were actually saying we were going to do. Like, yeah, every section was kind of contradicting itself, it seemed.
Okay, great question. Let me go to the scoping section. So mostly a few works we ask for the community's feedback. One work is about deprecating the implementation using the open sensors and replace it with open telemetry. Another piece we asking for community feedback is which features we plan to promote from alpha to beta. So there are mainly two options, right? One is we only promote the open telemetry features. For example, currently we have the open telemetry access log, but we still need for open telemetry tracing and also the open telemetry metric. That's one potential direction. I think the feedback from John is this doesn't sound good to him because he thinks Prometheus Zipkin should also be supported. Essentially, this alternative support multiple providers. I see there are some. Okay. Anyone raise a hand?
Yeah, no, it's a question.
Yeah.
So I think basically second what John said, I read the document and I also don't know exactly what we are promoting to beta because open sensors replaced with open telemetry and implementation detail. We're not promoting anything to beta. And there is a discussion about adopting the semantic convention, which is clearly not promoting anything to beta. It's more about deprecating what we have, or I don't know, replacing or supporting two standards. I don't know what it is, but doesn't sound like promoting to beta anything. And on the API surface, yes, you are saying that we want to support Zipkin and whatever, but at the same time, you are saying that we are no longer supporting mesh config where the Zipkin was actually configured. Are you saying we are taking the Zipkin config and moving it to the proper CRDs and moving it to beta, or how does it look like?
Yeah, it looks like what you're talking about, right? Essentially moving this configuration to Istio telemetry API. And regarding to the semantic convention, that's actually one more piece we want to get the feedback from community. So if we basically depend on this work before we can declare telemetry API to be beta, the timeline may be longer. The alternative is to adopt the open telemetry semantic convention when it is ready. So it involves a few works. For example, we may first of all deprecate the existing labels, replace with the existing open telemetry semantic convention. Another work is we potentially need to upstream some service mesh related semantic conventions to OTel. So I imagine that will take some time. Yeah, go ahead.
Wait a minute. I mean, you are saying that, I mean, we are not taking the existing telemetry APIs at the CRD and moving it to beta, what we have there. We are taking the alpha one and moving it to, I mean, whatever is in mesh config, which remain in mesh config because we are not happy with the shape and you know, keeping Zipkin forever when everyone is moving to adopt OTLP. And we are taking a protocol that is deprecated and moving it to beta and promise to support it forever when again, the semantics were problematic because the person who's configuring access log level is not the same person who's configuring, you know, what the cluster is using, Zipkin or whatever provider. So that was why we kept them separated in the first place.
Yeah, let me try to quickly get to your question first before I go to answer Quart's question. So I'm not saying that this is a design doc, like what configurations from Zipkin going to Istio telemetry API, but it's mostly like a directional doc. Essentially, whether we need to maintain two sources of truth, right? One is mesh config, another is Istio telemetry API, or we want to single source of truth for configuration, which is less confusing, less maintenance. But whatever you said makes sense, but that's probably belong to the design, detailed design doc. Like for example, if we want to commit to support multiple providers, promises, Zipkin, what are the exact configuration we're going to support? I think that's belong to the detailed design. This is not intended for detailed design, just the scopes for the work, high level scoping. Quat?
Yeah, I just had a general recommendation to keep providers in general out of the beta scope. There is really nothing we can say about future of these providers. So we should not be claiming any status for the future, additional removal. So whatever we promote to beta should not be really include any other discussion about providers. Like Zipkin, Hotel, it's not really part of this.
Yeah, essentially, I guess Quat, you are in favor of we only doing open telemetry, right? Essentially, is a customer need some kind of adapters to convert the hotel telemetry to, for example, Prometheus, Zipkin, or whatever their backends. Is that my understanding correct? Or
well, I think that should be supported, but it's not part of beta scope. What I'm saying is that whatever we promote to beta is not really about hotel.
So you are saying those providers can be remain as alpha, or?
They don't have a status like alpha beta. It's just about the ecosystem, right? I mean, everything has an end. Hotel will probably be also replaced by something else in 5 years. So there's no point in claiming stability of those things as long as they are pluggable.
I see. Okay. John?
Keith was first. Go ahead.
Yeah, Keith. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what would be helpful for me trying to understand the direction for telemetry API in trying to get something to beta would be more information or maybe some docs or some discussion on ones about Costin was talking about before. What are the current things gunking up the works? What are we not happy with as a community? What do we want to change? What do we need to change? And then if the next step is not getting telemetry API to beta, maybe the next step is to get telemetry API to a V1 Alpha 2 that has breaking changes of some sort, right? Grant, and it's a little bit harder, but less on the specifics. But it sounds like there's a lot of opinions around what needs to happen with telemetry API and what's missing or what's wrong with the API. And so I think it'd be really helpful to have that collected somewhere so that if we need to start from scratch as a community, we can.
Yeah, Case. So one thing about what is missing from Istio telemetry API is about the Istio open telemetry support. For example, the open telemetry tracing, open telemetry metric. John, sorry.
Yeah, I think this is somewhat agreeing with what Quad said. I don't know why a doc that says promote the telemetry API to beta has only discussion about open telemetry, which seems completely orthogonal. Like why does the API being promoted to beta depend on any open telemetry things? That's why I'm mostly confused.
Yeah, let me try to elaborate on that, right? So when we say it's beta, right, we need to define what features are beta, right? For example, is it open telemetry access log beta or open telemetry tracing beta? If we are only saying, I guess the intent is to be more specific, like which features should be beta. That's the reason mentioning the open telemetry stuff. Yeah.
The confusion is between API and implementation. So we are discussing, the title is telemetry API, which means set access log or access log true for those workloads, or set tracing to 10% for this other workload. That's a telemetry API. It doesn't matter how it's implemented. So there is no relation with OpenTelemetry or with anything. The only question is, can we support it in Istio with whatever we choose now or in the future? Can we support it with ambient, which again, it's an important factor because we should not promote an API to beta if we know that, a few months later, we're going to say it's not supported anymore. And finally, are we the right group to define telemetry APIs, or should we try to work with either OpenTelemetry or Kubernetes folks to have a Kubernetes-wide telemetry APIs? That's my preference. Obviously, I mentioned this before. I don't think Istio telemetry is how telemetry should be configured in general for tracing and access log.
Yeah, so I guess, Costin, if I understand your point correctly, is you actually don't think we should mention the provider concept. Essentially, we just, the API just declare the functionalities, like, for example, the sampling rate, but it doesn't need to mention, for example, whether it's promises or whether it's OpenTelemetry. It just the high-level stuff without... So essentially, then that's single provider, right? If the provider concept is gone, essentially only the functional stuff. Is that you are trying to get into, or?
No, I didn't say it's gone. I'm saying that the API is not constant. It's a different APIs that, vendors may configure whatever they want. I mean, it's a different API. One API is to configure, but choose an implementation to use, which is part of any other authorization or whatever. You choose what implementation you use. And the other API is how you configure access levels and tracing. I mean, there are different personas, different tasks, different APIs, and each API can have multiple implementation, but it's not, in the API, you don't specify what implementation is going to be used.
Sure. In the API, we don't specify implementation. That sounds good, but to be more specific, that in Istio, we only have one implementation for API, right? So suppose we have a beta API now, then the implementation should only one. There should be only one implementation, right?
We have multiple implementation. We have traces with Zipkin. With have 3 or 4 tracing. We have 2 or 3 access log. We have multiple metrics. We have multiple implementations already.
Okay, but in order for the user to specify which implementation to use, is it through some kind of a provider concept? For example, for tracing, the user may specify, I want to use Zipkin, and I configure the sample rate to be XYZ, right?
But those are 2 different users. One is a user who's, user who deploys an application and wants that application to have 5% tracing. And the other is a cluster admin or vendor that specify where traces go. For example, Google will say traces go to Stackdriver because that's our managed tracing solution. Or another vendor may say they go to that's a vendor or operator of the cluster. There are different persona, different APIs. We may add an API for the second. I don't know. That's a different story. But which API you want to promote to beta? The API that is vendor specific, which each vendor is using, or the API that is user specific and users use to configure access logs?
I think either. So when you say persona, you mean the configuration is implicitly deduced from persona? For example,
I'm a developer. I want to deploy an application and configure access logging and tracing for that application. That's the persona of the developer. Another persona is I'm a vendor that is providing Istio for customers, and I configure Istio to send traces and whatever to my solution. Another is I'm doing a self-contained Istio, and I deploy Prometheus, and I want all users to use Prometheus. So it's a different kind of operation. Different. I don't know how to explain. Keith, maybe you know better.
I was going to go kind of a different direction, so I want to make sure you've got a chance to finish the thought.
No. I think it's pretty clear what persona is.
Yeah, so I want to kind of go back to first principles a bit, and apologies if I'm just newer to the conversation around telemetry API, but you know, it seems to me that the goal of the API is to allow users to dynamically configure their telemetry settings in a namespace way for their specific applications, using workload selectors as opposed to all the information in mesh config. Is that we all on the same page about that?
Yeah, that makes sense, right?
I think you can also do mesh config. I'm sorry, you can also do telemetry resource globally for the mesh, right? So that's another, like if you
the
do
root namespace. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, we have root namespace for mesh-wide, application for the telemetry API. We have namespace. We have workload selector. Yeah, these are part of the Istio telemetry API.
Okay, so if those are the goals, I agree with John that the specifics of what implementation or provider, etc., those seem orthogonal to what this API should do. If we want to, in my mind, this telemetry API should contain knobs for different trace sampling options, for maybe metric relabeling, etc., in as much as it's possible to do that in a generic way. Looking at telemetry API right now, it seems like it's this weird blend of provider things and these settings. Maybe I'm misunderstanding that, but I got to go to the reference to be sure. But when I look at the doc, at least, it seems like there is this blending between provider things and changing settings. Is it possible for us to? I guess what I'm trying to say is, can we go back, instead of having a doc about a lot of implementation things and kind of coupling the OpenTelemetry, open telemetry migration and wire things? Is it possible to decouple that from the idea of just telemetry configuration?
Yeah, I like that, right? So essentially, I think the doc probably is confusing, right? So essentially, hotel is mentioned here only as an example of one type of provider, right? Essentially, at the top level, the user may care, right? For example, I want to export telemetry data to, for example, Zipkin, right? For example, tracing to Zipkin. How should I use Istio telemetry API to achieve that, right? So there are maybe, I guess, a few ways. One way is you specify the provider to be Zipkin, and then you configure some, sampling rate of the tracing. Then you call it down, right? Another user may say, I want to export this to OpenTelemetry collector, and I configure the provider to be OpenTelemetry and configure a bunch of things. So I think, let me try to clarify, right? So I'm not saying this is, coupled with OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry is only one example providers. We may have Prometheus, we have Zipkin, we have other backends, but still, for a user to use this API, right? The user needed to be able to configure it in some way. An alternative I heard from, I guess, Costin is you don't need to configure the provider explicitly. Somehow through a persona, it is deduced implicitly. For example, it is, Zipkin. It somehow knows it's Zipkin. You don't need to care about which provider. You just configure, for example, sampling rate, some high-level telemetry configurations. But so I guess the goal of this talk is to get some consensus what exactly at a high level the API should look like without going to the technical details like OpenTelemetry, right? It's not an implementation or not even design doc. It's just the behavior for beta, right? The API should, what the API should look like at a high level. Yeah. Lin?
Yeah, I think I agree with the comments mentioned by Keith and everybody else here. It seems to me the two pieces, we have to be clear on the scoping of this document, right? When I think about telemetry, I'm thinking about two places to configure, right? One is the telemetry resources, which is available to user to configure namespace, a workload, or maybe to the admin to configure mesh wide, right? So that's one resource. So it wasn't clear to me if you are promoting just that telemetry API to beta. So that's the one question. The second thing, I think as a probably not a user role, is the configuring of the provider, which is typically done through the mesh configuration. So what's not clear to me of your document or your intention is the mesh config portion that's related to telemetry provider. Are you also looking at promote that to beta, or is that like a 2BD outside of the scope of this document?
Yeah, Lin, so regarding to mesh config, one feedback we get from customer is it's confusing. Essentially, there are two ways to configure telemetry, right? One is still telemetry API, another mesh config. It's harder to debug customer issues. And for customers, there are like two sources of truth to configure telemetry. So I want to get the community feedback whether it's okay to do a single source of truth, right? Only use Istio telemetry API to config telemetry and remove the mesh config.
So would that imply the telemetry API would have additional change to config provider as well?
Potentially, yeah, but it may not need to be changed. For example, it may be just some implementation change, not the API change. I think the API wise, currently this workload selector, mesh wide application or namespace application, they are already there. I don't think that part need big changes. I think the part is one part is the mesh config part. Another part is like which features are we going to promote to beta, or we just intended all this to be alpha for a long time. So that's something we want to get some feedback.
Okay, sounds good. I think I'm going to echo what Keith mentioned earlier. I think this document is also missing a background information section, which is extremely important. If you have data information or other people have data information on what's not working with telemetry today, I think it would be really good to document that so we can keep those in mind as we're thinking about promoting this to the next phase.
Yeah, sounds good. I think we can add some background. For example, it's confusing to have two sources of truth to provide some context. That's that's something we can do. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Nirajan?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I had a question. I think John left a similar comment in the doc in terms of like what it means to sort of deprecate something from mesh config. I'm also kind of thinking about the upgrade story and backwards compatibility. Like if a field is removed, deprecated from mesh config, does that mean in like the next minor versions, like users would have to switch over all those settings to telemetry API right away, or will there be some period where it's discouraged, but like it's still consumed by mesh config? I also left a comment on fields like extension providers, which sort of control both security and extension providers and default providers, which control both like security and telemetry settings.
So for the mesh config stuff, my understanding is it's currently alpha. According to Istio feature status web page, for alpha or experimental features, it can be deprecated anytime. But for stable features, you need some advance notice. John? Yeah.
Yeah, I shouldn't have left a question. I should have probably been a bit more prescriptive. Deprecation here needs to be saying that we don't use this, but keep it around for at least 5 releases. It's not really true that mesh config is alpha. It's not really defined. And access log file is the most popular field in mesh config by a massive order of magnitude. So removing it anytime in the next few releases is kind of not feasible.
Yeah,
I would maybe even say ever, but at the very least for a year or so.
I agree with John. Ever, I mean, we keep it as long as we have users. When we find out that nobody is using access log somehow, surveys or whatever which is here, then we may discuss removing, including access log, which is obviously the most popular.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But that doesn't mean we will not recommend people to adopt semantic conventions or tell and whatever. It's just that we are committed to maintain backward compatibility to the end of the day.
Any other comments? Okay, thanks.
All right. Do we have any other topics? Okay. If not, then let's get these 20 minutes back, and I'll see most of you at the NBN meeting. Bye, folks.